Good evening. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming out this evening. My name is Laura Heisler, and I'm delighted on behalf of the three entities that share this building, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, and the Mortgage Institute for Research, to welcome you to the final Crossroads of Ideas session for this semester. This evening also happens to be one of the sessions that we've been sharing all semester with our colleagues in the sociology department from the class Forward, the Wisconsin Idea Past and Present. And so those of you taking the class, welcome as well. I would like to take this time to thank Patrick Brenzel, Eric Sandgren, and Gwen Drury and their colleagues for allowing us to partner with them this semester on this series. It's been really great from our perspective in managing the Crossroads series to be able to share this. So thank you so much. And Eric asked me to mention, those of you taking the class, there is still one more session that'll be taking place next week. And I believe there will be cake if you stay. Is there anything else that, I'm imagining others are welcome to come have cake as well. That'll be across the street, is that right, in the Biotechnology Center? Anything else you want the class to know, Eric?
That's the important thing.
All right, great. So I have a couple of things to mention just about this series and about tonight's session. Those of you who have come to other Crossroads sessions know that this series was born from the three entities in this building wanting to really create an opportunity to interface with the public about issues of interest in all of our lives that also happen to be the subject of research at UW-Madison. And so each semester, one Tuesday a month throughout the academic year, we tackle different subjects. This semester, we've been very focused on the convergence of the Wisconsin idea and issues in scientific research that affect us all. Next semester, we'll be tackling a number of very controversial subjects, including celebrating the bicentennial of Frankenstein, talking about the genomics revolution, and featuring a couple of really interesting projects that are part of the UW-Madison 2020 initiative, which is high stakes, high reward research. And so do stay tuned for that series. If you're on our mailing list, we'll send you notifications as those lectures come together. If you would like to be on our mailing list and aren't already, please do sign up at the entrance where you came in and just let us know, and we'll add you to that list. One more housekeeping note before I introduce our speaker. We will have about 45 minutes of lecture and then an opportunity for question and answer with Paula. If you do want to ask a question, please wait until one of the mic runners reaches you. We're of course taping all of these sessions. The tape will be available on the discovery.wis.edu website, and then eventually possibly on the Wisconsin Public TV's University Place Presents series. So we are working with them on that series. So we are taping, so we do ask you to wait for the mic to reach you. So with that, I would love to introduce Paula Niedenthal, our speaker this evening. Paula is an effective scientist who studies the social function of emotion, facial expression of emotion, and how these vary across culture. She earned her BA from UW-Madison and her PhD from the University of Michigan, and was on the faculty of the Departments of Psychology at Johns Hopkins University and Indiana University. From 1998 to 2011, she was a member of the National Center for Scientific Research in France, and in 2011, she returned to UW and is now the Howard Leventhal Worf Professor of Psychology and Principal Investigator of the Nedenthal Emotions Lab. She is the author of one of the leading textbooks on the science of emotion and has published over 100 empirical articles in the field's highest impact journals. And we are delighted to welcome Paula Nedenthal.
Thank you for coming. Thank you also for the introduction, Laura, and thank you for the invite from Eric and from Gwen. And thank you all for coming on this first day of winter. It was so blustery. This is my provocative title. I'd like to talk today about the path from basic to applied research. And my talk will cover really 3 points, one of which was required by the first talk by Gwen Drury. I'll speak a little bit about my take on the Wisconsin idea and its importance. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about basic research in science, how it happens and what it is. And then I'm going to use my own research to talk about the steps that lead us to interesting applications, most of which and most of the time we wouldn't have anticipated while we were doing basic research. I want to also say that I give this talk in my undergraduate depth course, which is about 90 students who are mostly juniors and seniors, and so it's an adaptation for you. I know who my 90 students are, but I don't know who you are. And so there will be some things that you already know and some things that you don't know, and I apologize in advance for anything that's sort of routine for you, and I hope somewhere something that I'm going to say is novel or useful. So we know already what the Wisconsin idea is because I'm coming at the end of this interesting, very interesting class. So the Wisconsin idea was articulated around the turn of the century, the last century. And Gwen Drury asked us to think about the issue of the distinguishing aspect or distinguished aspect of the Wisconsin idea. In fact, she noticed that, or noted that, there are many land grant institutions in the United States, some of them older than the University of Wisconsin, and yet there is not necessarily a university of whatever idea or whatever state idea. And the question is sort of, is the Wisconsin idea unique and special in some way? Or are we just using a name for something? When I think about what's so special or whether the Wisconsin idea is special, my instinct is to refer to the education-hungry immigrants that populated Wisconsin in the middle of the 19th century. My maternal grandmother was born in this cabin. It's very small. It's south of McFarland, in between McFarland and Stoughton. There were 5 people in that house, and she descended from people, my great-grandparents, who lived in dugouts along the Yahara River. So that would look like what you read about if you ever read On the Banks of Plum Creek. I don't think that these people were very special. In fact, I know that they were not. But my grandmother, Dorothea Nelson, went to Whitewater State Teachers College and earned a teaching degree in the class of 1912, which is a date that's going to come up again here in this talk. She ultimately became a country school teacher and taught in places around DeForest and also McFarland. And because of the nature of the effects of World War I on my grandfather, she also raised 4 little girls alone, sort of similar to Little Women or The 5 Little Peppers and How They Grew, which 2 books that were in our house. One of the important things for my grandmother was to raise at least 2 of her children to go to the University of Wisconsin. And that's what happened. My mother, Corinne Helmke Niedenthal, and her identical twin sister went to the University of Wisconsin and graduated in art education in 1951. Ultimately, my mother was an art teacher in Lake Mills, in Racine, and at Madison East High School. She also, I find this an interesting historical fact, I knew the fact, but I think you might be interested in it, was the winner of the most meritorious piece of art at the Wisconsin Salon of Art in 1954, which is also the most meritorious award of the Salon. If you look at the envelope, which I have now, you can see the contribution to the $250 that she won, including Renabombs and the Milwaukee State Journal. Interesting also, I think, for the history of journalism, for those of you who are interested here, is the fact that although my mother won first prize, the man from Janesville who won second prize was mentioned first in this article and in the headline. But fortunately, they pictured my mother with her piece of art. She was quite surprised. I grew up in Chicago, that I followed in her legacy and graduated from the University of Wisconsin with a degree in psychology in 1981, and even more amazed when our first son graduated from the University of Wisconsin in not 1916, but 2016. And I would like to argue, or I know, that all of these accomplishments were the realization of an educational goal of one of many immigrant families in Wisconsin, none of whom believed that what they were doing was creating an elite person or a lazy person, but an incredibly hardworking and educated person, because these immigrants believed that education was the foundation for our state and our state's economy. And I know that to be true. So were these immigrants unique to Wisconsin? We know that they're actually not. I don't think that my story is likely to be very unique. I know that my story is not unique in part because of the parallels to my father's family from the state of Kansas. And so I'm a scientist and I don't use case studies, but because Gwen asked me to talk about the Wisconsin idea, all I can do is use case studies. I'm a psychologist and not a demographer and not a historian. And I think that the parallel to Kansas is incredibly interesting in revealing what's unique about the Wisconsin idea. In particular, because Kansas State University, which has an amazing extension, was the first or the earliest land-grant university in the United States. And Kansas is interesting to me because my paternal grandparents were wheat farmers in Russell, Kansas. Now, some of you know Russell, Kansas if you're old enough, because it's also the hometown of Bob Dole, who's still alive, and was the hometown of Arlen Specter, who preceded my father in an incredibly effective debate program. So this picture is not a picture of my grandmother with my father. It's a picture of my grandmother with one of her 2 children who didn't survive, not because of the Dust Bowls, which were also occurring, but because she was Rh incompatible with my grandfather. So I think of these people as highly resilient. And one of the ways in which she was resilient was to drive my father around the whole state of Kansas so that he could become one of the state champions. Also, Arlen Specter, if you haven't noticed, was a very good debater, sometimes not a very emotional one. And he ultimately received a scholarship to go to Northwestern University, not Kansas State, and became professor of preaching at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. And once again, I would claim that my grandparents believed that this was a distinguished and non-elite achievement. So the question is there a Kansas idea, or was there a Kansas idea? And I don't really think there was a Kansas idea in the exact same way. In particular, despite the fact that both institutions, KU and K-State, are unbelievable, the extent and the reach of the systems are not the same as the University of Wisconsin, nor was there a special relationship with the state that I think that we had here in the state of Wisconsin, to my knowledge. And so if we return to the year of 1912, we can see that there's this really important mix of the University of Wisconsin, of the immigrants coming to the age of becoming educators, and the state and federal governments, that in my mind create something that's the Wisconsin idea, because it has created a special synergy between those 3 organizations and institutions. So I guess that would be my take on the specialness, and my conclusion is that there is a specialness and a uniqueness to this particular institution. So when I'm teaching at the University of Wisconsin, and when I execute my role as somebody who teaches to the state, also for the Speakers Bureau, for example, I'm conscious of the fact that the Wisconsin idea asks the university professors to address or respond to the actual needs of the people of the state, their concerns, which implies that I conduct in some way, or am capable of conducting, or bringing applied research and research problems to the people of the state. So my question, because of my own training, and my question to my undergraduates in my classes, is can we conduct applied research without also conducting basic research? And I often ask them, in light of the Wisconsin idea, do you value basic research? And are you sent to the University of Wisconsin valuing basic research? Are you told that I'm standing in an ivory tower and that the things that I'm doing are not applicable? And, you know, I try to convince them to be honest, and not very many of them raise their hands. In other words, they don't raise their hands when I ask them if they were sent by parents who said that it was an ivory tower, which is reassuring. Nevertheless, I still think that I have a responsibility to help them understand that path, and to help other people to understand that path if I can represent the Wisconsin idea. So a definition of basic research, of course, is research that's directed at the increase of acquisition of knowledge, of findings or understandings about subjects under study, which can range across all of the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. And the basic research, some of you probably know because you exercise this activity, involves a number of steps, which I'll describe. And it also often involves funding, because if there's something that you can say about science, scientific research anyway, because that's what I know, you can say that it's very hard. And it's also iterative, and it's also expensive. And so after talking briefly about the funding opportunities and activities, I'll talk about the evaluation of our work and its diffusion, meaning our publication, our impact, and even our discussions with the media. So the steps to basic research looks pretty much like this. This is what I do. When people sometimes say to me, by the way, what do you do during the day? Have you ever noticed how many people's activities you don't understand? I was once in a restaurant somewhere with somebody who is a financial officer for the company Michelin Tires. And I just looked at him and said, George, what do you do during the day? What does a financial officer for Michelin? And his wife leaned forward and said, yes, tell us. Because she didn't know. So these are the activities that I do on my way to basic research. I read a lot, because I have to know what's already been said, because science is iterative and it grows and it makes mistakes and then it's self-correcting. It's just totally not linear and it's not as satisfying as all of that. And after reading and synthesizing and thinking and trying to be creative and taking time off from those activities, you try to develop a theoretical approach or a model. Based on the model, you conduct experimental research, experimental studies if you're me. There's other kinds of things that you could do. And to the findings of those studies, you apply statistical techniques that result in your ability to draw conclusions, to write, and to hope that some editors are going to like it enough and some reviewers are going to like it enough for you to publish it. This process can take easily 10 years or longer. Sometimes it can take 3 if you're really lucky. This is what we hope our graduate students can achieve. It's pretty hard. So sometimes they just come in on the experimental studies end, right? But let's stop right there. What I just described is unbelievably expensive. I just showed you a bunch of words, and the words are cheap. But if we unpack each of those steps, that's really, really expensive. And even my research is probably not as expensive as some other people's. And so we have private and public institutions that provide us with money to conduct our basic research. And sometimes, and some of those institutions of greatest concern to you are public institutions that rely on, in particular, federal tax dollars. These are institutions such as the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, the Office of Naval Research. Those are examples. There are also private institutions that use private money to fund issues, topics, subjects, and questions of interest to those institutions. In my field, people might be funded by the Templeton Foundation, by the California Wellness Foundation if they study mindfulness, by the Spencer Foundation if they study education. So here are some private institutions that are not using, that are not relying on your tax dollars, and they're useful for us, of course, in conducting our basic research. The processes, though, are quite different. For those of us who have served on the panels that evaluate grant proposals to the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health, we know what people are going through to ask for tax dollars. People write grant proposals that are up to 15 to 25 single-page pages just to explain the importance and the types of activities they're going to do. That's just the proposal. There are many other parts, including budgets and budget justification and personnel. And these enormous documents are sent to people who are experts in the field but not associated with the principal investigator to evaluate, in addition to at least 2 people on that particular panel. And then there are 3 days of discussion of those grant proposals. And I remember thinking the first time that I went to Washington to serve on an NSF panel, how actually fundamentally ethical and rigorous this process was. I'm sure people have sat on other kinds of grant panels, but mine was powerfully rigorous. Private institutions use different models for deciding whether they're going to fund research. And sometimes those models mimic pretty well what the NSF and what the NIH do, in the sense that the ideas for the research are sent out to other experts to evaluate. And all of this, just like in business, is about the question of, is this a good risk? Is this a good investment? And people want to invest in different levels of risk. I would say, ooh, I just poured water on my computer. Here we go. Yeah, I think it's fine. I think it's good. I would say, oops, I don't even know what I was going to say. The one thing, though, that I always try to teach my undergraduates is that if you're reading about ideas or work, research, or findings, and you look back to see who funded it, there's a lot of information there. One time I read an entire book on adolescent brains, and I kept reading facts that I had never heard of. And while I'm not a neuroscientist, I know enough about neuroscientists' findings to reflect on what I was reading and wonder who had conducted the research. So when I looked in the footnotes, it turned out that all the research in that book had been funded by a particular think tank with a particular ideological basis. And I thought to myself, and I say to my students, this isn't too hard to learn. This is a no-brainer. It's hard to evaluate work, but it's not so hard to evaluate the fact that all of the research being cited has been funded by a private, thank you, institution that has a particular stake in what is being written and what is being found. So that's at the very least that people can think about whether or not there should be or is a hoped outcome to the basic research. Oops. Oops. Okay, now it's not moving. Shoot. Okay, let's see. Let's just start it over again. Okay, I think it's gonna work. I told my graduate student who's about to do a job interview not to drink water while she's giving a talk. So, you know, sort of sad. Oh, it's working. Okay. So we just talked about how private institutions operate somewhat differently than public institutions. But, you know, while consumers of science really need to understand that distinction and evaluate the funding opportunities and funding institutions, again, you're most worried about how, or at least for my talk, you're most worried about your tax dollars. And so let me just finish this part by explaining how research is evaluated and diffused. Like when somebody from the university communications office calls me, what's happened to my research before they make that call? And what's happened to my research before they make that call is that I had to publish it and it had to be evaluated by other experts in the field. So I achieve an article, which incidentally, for those of you who don't know, I do not get paid to do. Sometimes we pay to publish, we don't get paid to publish. We also don't get paid to review other people's research, and we don't get paid to be editors of journals. Sometimes people assume that that's true, and that's not true. That's just something that we're doing in the many activities that we're doing that, you know, you wonder about sometimes, and some of you don't, because you know. After a number of people read and evaluate how well we conducted, whether they think it could be replicated now, in particular, right now, the big concern is whether the number of subjects that we had or observations in the basic research were great enough and strong enough to be hoped to be replicated in subsequent research in other laboratories, and correctly analyzed and interpreted. Then we might finally reach that last stage, which is to publish a paper, and then somebody might call us from some other media and ask us to talk about our findings. But we really shouldn't talk about them until this exercise has been accomplished. So the question then is, after I've engaged in those steps towards basic research, I still have to answer the question, does this help Wisconsinites, or am I helping Wisconsinites? And even, am I going to be able to apply those findings in some way? And the answer is, when you're doing that, you don't know. You actually don't know what the applications are of your research. The older you get, the closer you get to knowing what the applications are. But when you first start out, you simply don't. And many of you have already heard this now getting somewhat tired example, which is that the person who actually invented the kind of atomic clock that underlies our ability to engage in spatial navigation was not thinking of GPS. That's just not even the idea that he had. He said, with basic research, you don't begin to realize or recognize the applications until the discoveries are in hand. Okay, so that's really frustrating for taxpayers, but that's truly the case. So what is Applied research, then. What happens when we get to that applied research? The research that is applied is something that's designed to solve a particular problem, whether it's in organizational settings or educational settings. We're supposed to use something to solve problems. For example, to get rid of ghosts, to be ghostbusters. Being a ghostbuster is applying a solution. So I study emotion. And this is a sort of interesting topic to study in the state of Wisconsin because Senator Proxmire, at the time that he was senator, had a lot to say about basic research in emotion. Mostly what he said is, well, that's a waste of taxpayers' dollars. He subsequently, when he saw the application, for example, of the study of love to daycare centers, to research in animal care, to adoption, to education, and to attachment problems, then he said, oops, okay, so maybe even the study of love has some pretty important applications. So even he realized somewhat later. But it's true that the study of emotion is something where you can sit there as taxpayers and say, why do you do that? And where is it going? And I became most sort of intensely aware of this question when I got a Skype interview with Carl Zimmer for the New York Times, who wanted to put a very basic research paper and its findings and claims and models on the front page of the Science Times in 2011. He was reporting on a model that I'll show you briefly, just to show you the representation of a model that comes from synthesizing research, that wanted to explain and predict how the brain and behavior work together to facilitate our understanding of facial expression of emotion. And we focused particularly on the human smile for reasons of its diversity in form and function in social life. So Carl Zimmer called, and I had to articulate this in a way that would make sense to the New York Times readers. But most interestingly, were the comments that people wrote about the eventual New York Times article. Most of them were really complimentary, and it was exciting to see how people found sense and application of that particular article in their life. But there are two that were less nice. One said, my number one hope is that all liberals waste their time on useless work like this instead of vainly attempting to impede mankind's upward progress. And another said, I can only thank God that scientists are taking the time to study smiles. For a while, I thought they might be wasting their time trying to find a cure for cancer. What a relief. Sarcasm all around. I show these two quotes to my students in my upper division psychology class, not because I want to make fun of them, because I think that they are not wrong. They're just a not very nice way of asking, what the hell are you doing with my tax dollars and why? And that article on the front page of the Science Times was not about the application of my research, so they really had every reason to ask. And when I talked to my Aunt Dora Lee, also from Kansas and still living in Dodge City, Kansas, about this, because I knew that she might not be somebody who wanted to fund basic research in the social sciences, she said, correctly, well, Paula, honey, in that really lovely southern Kansas accent, if you could just explain the implications in words that we understood, we might want to pay for your research. And she's also right, just like the people who were commenting on the New York Times. And this is what I also tell my undergraduates. So Aunt Dora Lee was right. So I have to argue how my basic research on facial expressions and smiles in particular help the people of Wisconsin. That's my obligation, as told by my Aunt Dora Lee. And I feel like I finally can, and that's what I want to end my talk on. I want to end my talk showing you the road from my basic research on the human smile to something that Wisconsinites should care about and might be able to use in their life. My reading of the literature, long reading of the literature, which includes, human emotion literature on what facial expressions look like, to the study of the brain circuitry that's involved in both interpreting and producing facial expression, suggested to me at least 3 sets of hypotheses, one having to do with how many smiles there are, like really different types of smiles, some things about what circuitry in the brain supports our ability to recognize facial expression of emotion, and something about the behaviors that we engage in, small, low-level behavior that also helps us interpret facial expression. So my model gave me ideas and strong assertive hypotheses regarding these three ideas. In particular, for example, a hypothesis that we could derive from reading the literature on smiles carefully and then conducting research was that there are three fundamental kinds of smiles that have evolved to solve at least three problems of successful human group living. One is that we have to reward other people's behavior. So maybe there's a particular smile that causes other people to be rewarded in their behavior and to repeat it again in the future. One is affiliative smiles that has really not so much to do with positive emotion, but has to do with the need to signal non-threat or openness to affiliation. So this is what happens when you cross somebody on the street who you don't know that well, but you've seen before, and you recognize them and say, like, yeah, we're okay together. Or the smile that you give when you walk into a closed, icky elevator and saying, we're going to be in a small space together, but it's okay. And finally, a third kind of smile, often seen in sports exchanges and also international relations, which is serving the negotiation of social hierarchies. The dominant smile is there to say, I'm actually at this very minute higher status than you are. We spent a lot of time looking and a lot of basic research time exploring and understanding these smiles. And in addition, we spend a lot of time trying to work out the green layer, which is behavior, social behavior, and the brain, the blue layer or the gray layer, which has to do with a sort of overtime explanation of how the perceiver, this guy right here, can figure out whether that smile is a reward, affiliation, or dominance smile. And I just want to point out that I'm not going to try to teach you the model because that would be a long time and you don't care. But what you do care about is that the two behaviors of particular interest that are going to serve for this talk are eye contact, which occur in the middle, and facial mimicry, which occur on the far right between the two people. Because our reading of the literature suggested, and our research now have suggested, that when we engage in eye contact, mutual eye contact with someone, we're more likely to mimic their facial expressions. So eye contact kind of serves as a mimicry trigger. We also know now, and had this hypothesis derived from the literature, that mimicking somebody's facial expression makes in ourselves a model of what they're feeling and helps us reason over that. And we do a better job at being empathic if we mimic their facial expressions. And we also know something about culture and the fact that cultural misunderstandings have something to do with different rules for eye contact and facial mimicry in social interaction, particularly in interaction with strangers. This is all my basic research. It resulted in a lot of different articles, some of which have appeared in non-formal settings. For example, meeting these two newscasters in Live at 4, who were very interested in the different kinds of smiles. But this is all basic research. And so one time, I was watching kids in my children's daycare center, and I noticed, at least in France, the kids are allowed to use their pacifiers. And I said to myself, you know, when we manipulate facial mimicry in the lab, what we do is put stuff in people's mouths so they can't mimic. What happens if you use pacifiers in social interaction, as opposed to at night, for example? And so a possible applied implication of the model that I just showed you and didn't explain in detail, so trust me, is that protracted use of pacifiers during during times where social interaction is possible maybe isn't such a good idea, because it prevents you from creating that really important model of somebody else's facial expression and emotions. So we decided to study this in the lab. This is what I would claim to be something like applied research. We wanted to find out a really applied question. Are pacifiers bad for you? And if they were, they're going to be just as bad for Wisconsinites as for other people. So we adopted a task that we've used in other research, in which people look at morphed images that create movies of people whose facial expressions go from one expression to the next. And we had children come into the lab and observe those morphs, because we knew, because of the use of this task in other research, that people have a tendency to totally mimic those faces. when I show undergraduates these morph movies, I look out and they're all doing the same thing. It's very powerful. And our question was to the parents, how long has this child used a pacifier, and have they used it at night, and et cetera. These kids were 5 and 6 years old, and the parents had good recall for their use of pacifiers. And what we could do was to assess the amount of facial mimicry that the child showed in the lab and relate it to the amount of pacifier use that they had engaged in during the day and night as a comparison. And the findings were different for boys and girls. What we found was the longer that boys used pacifiers, the less facial mimicry they engaged in when they were watching facial expressions in action. So their dynamic facial displays in response to a dynamic facial display was largely reduced. So notice this is the number of months of pacifier use, and this is the amount of facial mimicry. The girls did not show an improvement. There's no difference. So girls, and I can talk about that some other time. I don't have time to in this talk to discuss why boys and girls might differ here. But there was a really significant effect for boys. So then we went on, oh, here. This is a boy who never used a pacifier. I just wanted, ooh. That's just detecting I can't turn it down. So you can see that he made a lot of facial expressions while he was looking at that face. You can't see perfectly because he put his head down a little bit. But you can compare him to this boy who used a pacifier for 4 years. So basically, you can't tell what the child is looking at because they're not doing anything in reaction to the facial expression. These kids were in France, but in none of our studies have there been any differences across culture. After we conducted this study, we did 2 kind of large questionnaire studies. We asked students in France and at the University of Wisconsin and at a university in Georgia about the extent of their pacifier use. We also asked them to call their parents if they didn't know, and we also asked them if they had called their parents. It turns out that there was no difference between those who had checked and those who had not checked about their pacifier use. You can also decide that they might not have a good memory for length of time, so you can just compare users with non-users, and these effects are the same. We compared, or we predicted, or we related pacifier use to 2 interesting variables. One was emotional intelligence. So this is a set of capacities, abilities to read facial expression, regulate emotion, and understand other people's emotions in general. And another was a component of empathy called perspective taking. And what we found was, and this is very impressive when you're a statistician, we found exactly the same effects for boys. That even though this is now 18-year-olds, and now we're measuring emotional intelligence and perspective taking, the longer they used a pacifier, the less good they were at that particular capacity. So in subsequent research, we also looked at the implications of using a pacifier for the parent observer, and found that parents, of course, I mean, you could claim that you can see that a child is making a facial expression behind the pacifier, but that's exactly what we studied. And parents' mimicry of kids with pacifiers in their mouth is also reduced. The fact that it's blocking part of the facial expression has consequences for the interactant, that is the caretaker, the parent. In this particular case, we used mothers. This is a case in which we took what we learned from basic research and applied it to a question that is of relevance to parenting, for example. More recently, we've also been working with the Facial Nerve Clinic at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. If you have trouble with face processing and certain kinds of emotional experiences due to pacifier use, you can imagine that facial paralysis that results from Bell's palsy or damage to the facial nerve, or quite differently, if you're born with a syndrome like Mobius syndrome that prevents you from moving your face, that you would also show either deficits, in this case, or differences in the case of Mobius syndrome, because you've never used your face to process facial expression. And so we've been partnering with the Facial Nerve Clinic We've already published some work on the role of facial paralysis in the processing of facial expression and facial mimicry, with the goal of better understanding the challenges of people with facial paralysis and different conditions of facial paralysis, and also helping them understand the impact of not being able to use your face to model somebody else's face in social interaction. One of the things that I've learned in interaction with that facial nerve clinic is that many people who I don't know my audience, but I'm just going to put this out there. Many people who reanimate the face have not thought very much about the face in social interaction. They're mostly trying to reanimate a nerve, but they're not really too sure why they're doing that. And I can say that because when I was asked to give a talk at an international facial nerve conference, the person who invited me stated that. She said, "We want you to give a talk because plastic surgeons and some ENT docs are not really thinking too much about how important it is to use your face and the kinds of consequences for not animating the face or reanimating the face a person actually lives with." So for me, this is the second application of the work that I do, and I have to say that I never at the beginning would have ever anticipated that I would be able to help the people in the state of Wisconsin with my basic research in these particular ways. These are ways that I would never ever have considered I could help. So I feel like while you can sort of think that somebody working on issues in computer engineering or in biochemistry is going to have a discovery that you understand is useful for you and meriting of your tax dollars, that I hope I've given you an example of another kind of research that might have been less intuitive for you at understanding this link between basic and applied research. So I want to conclude then with basically what I said or my final conclusions. That is that I believe that the Wisconsin idea is a unique synergy between the government, or at least it was, and hopefully still is, between the government, the university itself, and a particular kind of people who are resilient and who had a devotion and a belief in education for education's sake, and really not trying to reach any other kind of conclusion about what that would be. That research that's basic in the social sciences and the sciences is part of that mission, because basic research results in very surprising applications and risky interpretations that one can't anticipate before they engage in that exercise. And I finally believe that, of course, and I hope you do too, that believing in the Wisconsin idea is therefore believing in basic research and the activities of basic research. So thank you very much. So I think we have time for a couple of questions, several questions.
Thank you. So a number of us are involved in basic research, but do not in our own laboratories do the applied research. And I really like the connections you've shown there, you working on all of it. Do you think it is a much more effective way, or do you think translation occurs much more effectively when the people who do the basic discoveries also follow up? Or through all your extensive and exhaustive readings, do you really see examples of other people picking up on the basic ideas from a different laboratory and applying them just as effectively?
That I can't answer that, but I think that some of the readings that I assigned for this week provide some answers for it, which is that it does turn out to be the case that the wide web of basic research is linking to applied research with a distance and a reach that is quite remarkable. And at the same time, that it is true that people who push the edge of basic to applied research are having a big impact. And so I do think that it takes a very long time, but I do think there is a benefit of an institution, and I would say, having been at a number of them that were mentioned earlier, sometimes people have been at Wisconsin their whole career, don't recognize that we actually have had, and I hope we will continue to have, an institution that is far more organic and not top and bottom up than many institutions, of course, in the world, but even in the United States. And therefore, this has been, and I hope continues to be, a remarkable place for people to, at least if they can't do it in their lab, to work with other people, as I am with the facial nerve clinic. That just wouldn't even have occurred to me, really. So I think there's a sort of both to your answer, that I think there's a real benefit to doing that, but I don't think it has to be the case. And I also believe that our institution usually encourages that and has fostered that over decades.
I just wondered if you've given this talk to the legislature, because honestly, it just seems like something that is very straightforward in the way that you presented it, and it would be beneficial.
I've tried to so many ways on Twitter and in other ways. I have to say that I wrote a very long kind of editorial, and then my mother wrote the first half of it when she was still alive, and it covered all of this, including the first part of my talk. And we did send it and got, we sent it, for example, to Governor Walker, from whom we received a standard that thank you for your letter. So number one, I tried in that particular way. And I also invited many members of our government to this talk, or at least to the link online, by tweeting to them. I do think I have felt frustrated that we can't actually have that interaction, because I think that it's perfectly consistent with, if you look over the history of Wisconsin, and of course I'm, again, not a historian and an expert, so Gwen can correct me, but if you think about who Proxmire was and who La Follette was, this is not a question of partisan behavior. Like, sometimes the things that you learn about, you expect one particular party to have represented, and you're completely wrong, because you're having a very sort of short-term view of that party. So the claims that I made in my talk, I believe, are nonpartisan, and because I believe that, at least historically, they're not partisan. And I do believe also that it's quite an assault on our state to take a very recent partisan view of something that has as history as long as the University of Wisconsin, which is also something that I've tried to communicate. One of the things that I can say is, don't tell me about thoughts and prayers because my father was a theologian. Don't tell me about farms because I'm a farm owner. Don't tell me about guns because I have hunting rifles. And I can still have very strong opinions about the relationship between our state and our state values, so I don't really understand why they don't listen to us. Maybe you can explain that. Maybe, I think that people should be invited to this particular forum and should want to come.
My question relates to the research in France. What kind of controls did you have? Because I was very taken with the young boy who had no facial expression whatsoever. Did you control for the home environment?
Yes.
Whether they came from a very sad environment, restrictive environment, and so on?
We controlled for as many things as we thought could be independent predictors of facial mimicry and emotional expertise or emotional standing that we possibly could. So age of entry into daycare, length of time in daycare, number of siblings, sibship, whether they're born first or second, so sib order. So in subsequent studies, the two studies that were self-report, we also measured state and trait anxiety and also attachment styles. So essentially, yes, I think that I actually have a whole talk on the question of causality and the question of control in that research. In that kind of research, you can't randomly assign children to use a pacifier or not. And so it's incumbent on us to make sure that we had avoided other kinds of third factor causations in this particular case. So, we did our best, and I think we did try to anticipate exactly the kinds of things, connections that you're thinking of. That's a good point. Yeah.
Given the difficulty of linking basic research to future applied research and the fact that funds are always limited, what are your thoughts on how to decide what basic research should be funded?
You mean, are you asking me whether I believe that the processes we have in place at NSF and NIH, for example, are good, or are you asking me to challenge the existing ones, or whether I have new thoughts in addition to the existing sort of processes? Do you think the existing processes are effective? I haven't seen every, I have a sampling, which is 3 years of being on a panel and also being a reviewer. And I've seen what kinds of research has been funded. Research that's going to be funded because it's inherently risky is not always going to result in being useful. So right away, we can't say that we're going to be able to put in place some way of funding research that guarantees that it will be either useful or even work out. So that's true. It's a longer term and more general investment than being able to sort the wheat from the chaff. Because if you go with really not risky, that's likely to work. It can also turn out to be trivial. And if you go for really risky, of course, it might not work at all. And so right now what we're trying to do, and I think we do it as well as we can. I haven't seen specific things that we can do except some of the corrections that we're currently doing, which is requiring that steps are taken for research to be robust and replicable, and that it's transparent, and that once you have invested in research, that those data become, and those products that result in the research become available to other people and largely free of charge, right? I should be able to ask other people for their research, their data that were collected on something having to do with emotions, because they actually also ask the kids if they use pacifiers, because I want to reanalyze those data, et cetera. So I think recently, we've been adding these requirements to conduct replicable research, to have transparent practices, and to have available data. And those are the kinds of changes that have made it better. And those are the only ways that I can envision doing that right now. It's sort of like nothing is going to ever be perfect. And have we gotten to as perfect as we can get right now? We're getting closer, I think. Gwen?
So I started thinking about a talk that was at the beginning of the semester in the same place, which was by the person currently in charge of the Wisconsin longitudinal study. And I started thinking about, wouldn't it be interesting if you could ask that big cohort of people who've been tracking for so many years what their pacifier use was, and then see if there are other things that you could explore with that. I just like to make connections, so I thought I'd throw that out there.
No, I mean, I think it's so difficult to conduct research like this that getting other people's data where they have actually asked that question. There are other data sets on campus that have started to add that question, which is a good idea. Oh yeah, Chris.
You said that it might not be until later in a researcher's career that they're able to answer a question like, what does your work do for Wisconsinites? But I think it's still fair to answer pretty much any scientist at any part in their career that question about their work. Do you think younger scientists are too conservative when that question's posed of them? Is it fair to ask them to dream a little more about their work? And
that's said by somebody in the media. It's really, I think that when in their training, that those of us who are on top of the graduate students are asking them to think about what those implications are. It's, you can, if you're in psychology, it's really easy for you to keep as a model the idea that the people who study attention may be interested in sudden onset of lights because pilots have to detect the onset of light. I remember thinking, that's a good example. I can tell people that psychologists study the allocation of attention to sudden onset because they're going to make that link to pilots having a big panel of stuff that they have to be able to detect quickly. So I would like all of our students to have that model in their head that they can pretty quickly say, my research is important for this reason, and I could imagine it being applied, or it's important for us to understand facial expression of emotion, because when we can't, we don't function very well. That's how I teach the function of emotion. We know that when we get rid of emotions, things don't go well economically or socially. We know when it goes really well, they go really well economically and socially. So that's what I say. So what we can do for students are or for younger scientists are two things. We can give them a good model for making that leap, at least in their head, that they say, I'm going to try to get to that point where I'm talking about sudden onset of lights and scientists looking at displays. I'm going to keep that in my head. And the other is to be able to at least say, that if you push around their phenomenon, if it comes and goes, things are different, and to look for what that ultimate application will be, whether it's individual differences in psychology, if it's individual differences, if it's psychiatric conditions, if it's education or development, that they should be able to do that. So they're scared, but they're not conservative. They're scared that something's going to get out there for which they have no evidence. But I don't think they shouldn't be encouraged to make the connection, and I agree with you. They should be able to defend the importance of what they're doing in light of what they know right now, not in light of what they've done. And then there's a person here.
Paula, for a great talk. My question is, does basic research that maybe never has any application have value?
I don't know whether we can ever say that basic research never has an application, because that requires a time perspective that we don't have. And so I'm a very strong believer in the role of basic research just teaching you something that you will use later that you don't recognize. It develops creativity, it develops expertise in methodology, it develops the ability to draw conclusions and to understand and use logic and understand and use experimental logic. And so I truly believe that it has applications that are going to be not very understandable or observable to other people. And so I think it always has value. 2 more questions. I know that there's one right here.
Just curious, would it make sense to sort of trying to justify the application of excited about discovery itself?
Wouldn't that be nice? I think that's the reason that there is this building, and so I'm not quite sure why we lost it in the first place. And I actually don't believe we've totally lost it. I believe that it's a narrative for political machinations, but I think at least in the state of Wisconsin, people still have that basic thrill in discovery. I gave a talk in Mercer, Wisconsin a couple of weeks ago, which is very far north. And I thought that every one of those 30 people was thrilling in discovery, and was just many people in the state of Wisconsin I have observed are very interested in you simply talking about ideas. And so I said that cynically, like, wouldn't it be nice? But I actually believe that people have that there somewhere. It's just incumbent on us to create the forum and to provide the resources to make sure that that keeps happening. I think that, again, what I was implying about the uniqueness of the Wisconsin idea is the reach of the institution, at least historically, was so great that it was really difficult to find somebody who was not being touched. I can, in fact, end with a story that I thought was so remarkable that I was about to ride the Elroy-Sparta bike trail, and the man who was driving us what did he do? Yes, we left our car in Elroy and drove to Sparta, whatever it was that we did, and he turned out to be a retired dairy farmer from outside of Elroy. And at some point he said, yep, at one time 6 of my 8 kids were in the Wisconsin system and extension, and he couldn't have been prouder. And I was like, wow, that is a reach. You know, I mean, I've heard of 1, but I haven't heard of 6 out of 8 at the same time or something, whatever that was. And I think that is a really good sort of moment where I was like, whoa, okay, you know, everybody's getting touched. So thank you so much for coming out today. Again, it was a real pleasure.
I have one more.
Everybody.
Do you have time? Do you have time for one more quick one?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
That's okay.
Sorry.
Thanks a lot for your talk tonight, Paula. I really appreciated it. I'll be quick. As a concerned citizen, I'm not convinced I would have ever been privy to this research about pacifiers. And I'm wondering if by going through this presentation and just earlier in your career, whether you've come up with any kind of novel ideas to kind of get the word out to the community outside of like Twitter, written news, media news, etc.
Well, I have to say that if there's anything I ever did in my entire life that has page after page after page after page of internet hits, it's this research. So I felt like people interviewed me tremendously after the University of Wisconsin did a really great press release. And I thought that it really went as viral as anything that I would do on the internet. And I don't really know how else to reach people, except that I do find that this is research that people find really useful and kind of compelling. And sometimes even that they go, yeah, that's not really surprising me. So if you have any ideas, I would love to hear them, because I think we all would like to know how we can make our research more accessible. I do have to say that one time I had conducted some very basic research that appeared to me to be very impenetrable. And it was in Glamour magazine, and my cousin was in an airplane and stood up and said, "My cousin's research is in Glamour." And I thought, well, there's a way to get it out. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
I think I'll just read more Glamour.
That's a good point. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.